Wilderness living was not only a test of endurance, but a canvas on which a new culture was painted. At the foot of Mount Sinai, the camp spread out like a circle of small villages. Each clan had its place, with the family of Aaron and the Levites positioned closest to the center, where a large tent stood. This tent, known as the tabernacle, was a portable sanctuary. Crafted from richly woven fabrics dyed in blues and purples and scarlets, supported by acacia wood beams and covered with skins, it contained the Ark of the Covenant behind a veil. Outside the tent stood a bronze altar for offerings and a basin for washing. The Levites were entrusted with its care. When the camp moved, they disassembled the tabernacle with precision, wrapping the sacred objects in cloth, loading them carefully onto carts or the shoulders of men. They reassembled it in the new location, always oriented with the entrance to the east. The layout of the camp itself was orderly. Each tribe pitched tents in its assigned quadrant, flags fluttering gently, each with a symbol that reminded them of their ancestors: a lion, a tree, a cluster of grapes. At dawn, the trumpet sounded. People emerged into the cool air. Women lit fires to bake flatbread from ground manna. Men gathered around leaders to hear instructions for the day. Who would scout ahead? Who would collect water? Who would stand watch? Daily sustenance during this time relied on manna, a flaky substance that appeared on the ground with the dew. It tasted like wafers made with honey. It could be ground, boiled, baked, and formed into loaves. The people learned to collect only what they needed for one day, except on the sixth day, when they gathered double to rest on the seventh. Quail sometimes flew into the camp at dusk, tired from long flights, and were easily caught and roasted. Water was the real challenge. In some locations, water flowed from springs hidden in rocks. At other times, Moses struck the ground as instructed, and water gushed forth, filling hollow places. There were also bitter waters that had to be sweetened by branches cut and thrown in. The scarcity of water led to quarrels. People complained, and tension grew between those who wanted to return to Egypt and those who were determined to continue. Moses' leadership was tested repeatedly. His arms grew heavy not from physical load, but from the weight of responsibility. When Amalekite raiders attacked the camp, men like Joshua led the defense, while others stood on a hill, holding up Moses' arms in prayer. In quiet moments, he climbed the mountain, disappearing into cloud and fire, seeking guidance. He returned with instructions, not just for religious ritual, but for civil law: how to resolve disputes, how to treat strangers, how to wrest the land. The desert itself shaped the people. The landscape of Sinai and the surrounding wilderness was starkly beautiful. Sheer cliffs of red and brown rock rose above gravel plains. Acacia trees offered small patches of shade. There were valleys carved by torrents that ran only during rare rains. In spring, small yellow flowers bloomed briefly, bringing color to the otherwise monochrome expanse. Nights were cold and filled with stars, so numerous that the sky seemed dense with light. People wrapped themselves in blankets and lay outside their tents, watching meteors streak across the darkness. The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of firewood and the occasional bleat of a goat. The desert taught patience. Moving too quickly drained strength and water. Moving too slowly meant missing the morning cool. Children learned to walk early, their feet toughened by stone and sand. They learned to identify venomous snakes by the patterns on their backs and to avoid scorpions that hid under rocks. They learned which plants could be chewed for moisture and which should never be touched. Even the wind had lessons. A sudden gust could blow sand into eyes and mouths, reminding people to tie cloths over their faces. The constant exposure to the elements made the community aware of their vulnerability. At the same time, it fostered resilience and adaptability. They fashioned sandals from animal hides that could be repaired and reused. They turned animal bones into needles and fish hooks. They used dried dung as fuel when wood was scarce. Not all moments in the wilderness were solemn or burdensome. There were celebrations. The community observed 3 major festivals each year, even without a permanent home. Passover commemorated their escape from Egypt with meals of lamb and bitter herbs eaten in communal fashion. The Feast of Weeks marked the grain harvest, though in the wilderness it became a celebration of receiving the law, with dancing and singing around the tabernacle. The Feast of Booths involved building temporary shelters made of branches, reminding everyone of their time living in makeshift dwellings. Weddings took place with brides wearing jewelry made from shells and small stones, and grooms promising to build new tents. Births were marked by prayers and songs. On the other hand, there were difficult lessons. When the people grew impatient and fashioned a golden calf to worship, believing that Moses had abandoned them, the consequences were severe. The calf was ground to powder, and the people were instructed to drink it in water as a bitter lesson. Plagues struck when they complained incessantly. Moses' own family experienced strife when his siblings challenged his authority. The wilderness also saw the moment when venomous serpents invaded the camp, leading to the creation of a bronze serpent set on a pole. Those who looked at it after being bitten were healed. These stories, told later, illustrate the tension between obedience and rebellion, between faith and fear. They reinforce that this time in the wilderness was a crucible out of which a people emerged with shared stories, laws, and a clearer sense of identity. The slow pace of travel and the wide expanses of empty land provided space not only for physical movement, but for internal reflection and for the weaving together of a community narrative that would endure long after their journey ended. The years in Egypt unfolded with a different texture than the years of wandering. The Nile was predictable, rising in late summer and retreating by early winter, leaving behind dark, fertile soil. Fields were laid out in narrow strips, each one assigned to families who worked them. Hebrew farmers learned to dig irrigation channels with their neighbors, to plant barley at the right depth, to weed carefully as stalks grew. The river provided not only water, but fish. Early in the morning, men cast nets from shallow boats made of bundled papyrus reeds. Children learned to swim in quiet backwaters, laughing as they splashed. The Delta region was lush with papyrus thickets, date palms, and fig trees. Fruit ripened in the warm air, and bees hummed in the blossoms. Women gathered lotus flowers to make garlands and pressed oil from flaxseed. Markets in the villages along the riverbank were vibrant. Stalls were covered by woven mats to provide shade. Baskets brimmed with vegetables, dried fish, and pots of honey. Potters shaped bowls on wheels, their hands wet with clay, while weavers sold linen cloth smooth and white. The Hebrews traded their wool and meat for these goods, and they learned to appreciate Egyptian flavors. Meals changed. Alongside roasted lamb and flatbread, there were now stews of lentils thickened with greens and jars of beer brewed from barley sweetened with dates. The work of women included pounding grain with heavy mortars, baking bread in domed clay ovens, and weaving mats from palm fibers. Children played games with pieces of polished stone, and at night, families sang songs they had brought with them from Canaan, mingled now with melodies they had learned from neighbors. Religious life in Egypt was rich and diverse. Every town had its own patron god or goddess, and temples were centers of social life. The Hebrews found themselves surrounded by rituals they did not participate in. They saw processions where priests of Horus or Osiris carried painted images through streets lined with onlookers. They heard hymns to Ra at sunrise and watched as sacred cats were groomed and honored. While living in the Delta, the Hebrews maintained their own traditions. They told stories of the patriarchs and taught their children to recite genealogies. They circumcised their sons on the 8th day and refrained from eating certain foods. At the same time, they could not avoid exposure to Egyptian customs. Their children learned to speak Egyptian fluently, sometimes better than the language of their ancestors. Names began to reflect local culture. Joseph's Egyptian name, Zaphanath-Paneah, echoed through his family. The Hebrews adopted aspects of Egyptian dress. Linen garments were lighter in the heat than woolen ones. Women lined their eyes with kohl to protect against glare. Men shaved their heads in the Egyptian style to keep cool. The assimilation was subtle and uneven. Some families embraced their host culture, finding joy in music played on the sistrum and dances performed at harvest festivals. Others were wary, holding tighter to their traditions and remaining separate. Over generations, social roles shifted. As new dynasties took power, policies toward foreign populations changed. At first, Hebrews enjoyed a favored status, especially under the Hyksos rulers who were themselves of foreign origin. They were free to graze their flocks and farm their plots. They grew numerous. Their songs became part of the sounds of the Delta. But when the native Egyptian dynasties regained control, a more xenophobic attitude emerged. The presence of so many foreigners was seen as a potential source of rebellion. Labor levies increased. Hebrew men were summoned to work on projects that supported the state, building storage cities, constructing defensive walls, digging canals to improve irrigation. The work was physically demanding. Under a hot sun, lines of laborers carried baskets of mud and straw to molds where bricks were formed and left to dry. Overseers, Egyptian officials, stood nearby with sticks, shouting orders. Hands grew calloused, shoulders burned, backs ached. Women and children took over tasks in the fields, trying to maintain harvests while the men worked elsewhere. Tensions grew. Memories of freedom to move and make choices became distant. The Hebrews looked back with longing at the days when they wandered with their flocks, free to decide when and where to travel. Now their days were dictated by the rhythm of a state they did not control. In whispered conversations during the evenings, elders reminded the community of promises made long ago. The idea of returning to a land promised to their ancestors resurfaced as more than a story. It became a hope passed from one person to another, a quiet refrain in a foreign land. These seeds of discontent would later grow into a desire for liberation. But at this stage, they were simply a longing for autonomy, a remembrance that the life of wanderers had once held a different kind of dignity. Behind Abraham was a world rich with complexity. The city he left, often associated with the ancient city of Ur on the banks of the Euphrates, was a place of mud brick houses clustered around narrow streets. Towering above them all was a ziggurat, a step temple whose summit was thought to bring priests closer to the gods. In the early mornings, women in long woolen dresses swept dust from doorways into the street. Merchants set up stands selling barley, dates, and fish from the nearby river channels. The scent of cooking oil and baking bread mingled with that of clay being fired. Children carried water jars from communal wells, balancing them on their heads with practiced ease. The city's craftsmen carved seals from lapis lazuli and etched scenes of myth onto clay tablets. Scribes in the service of temples sat cross-legged, stylus in hand, pressing wedge-shaped signs into soft clay, recording transactions and hymns to deities like Nana, the moon god. Canal systems fed fields that stretched beyond the city walls, where barley and wheat grew in tidy rows. Herds of pigs rooted in the mud along the canal banks. Palm trees lined the water's edge, their fronds providing shade. The rhythm of life in Ur was tied to the flooding of the Euphrates and to the administrative demands of temples and palaces. Festivals marked the turning of seasons. Processions carrying statues of gods moved through streets decorated with reed mats and flowers, and musicians accompanied them with harps and drums. Wealthy families displayed carved wooden furniture in their homes, and servants ground grain on flat stones. The city was comfortable, and leaving it meant abandoning both security and tradition. The decision to depart would have been an act of courage and perhaps of desperation. Stories later recorded in sacred texts tell of an inner voice or divine command. but there were also likely economic and environmental reasons. The region faced periodic droughts. The great cities were vulnerable to shifts in river channels and to political upheaval. Empires rose and fell, bringing changes in taxation and conscription. For a family that relied on pastoralism, rigid urban hierarchies could feel constraining. Abraham's household included not just his immediate family, but servants, relatives, and people who had joined him along the way. They would have packed provisions carefully. Each jar of grain, each skin of water, each coil of rope was accounted for. Animals were loaded with panniers. Women gathered strips of leather to repair sandals. The elderly were consulted and gave blessings, though some may have expressed sorrow at leaving ancestral graves. The group moved slowly at first, leaving behind the silhouette of the ziggurat gradually receding against the flat plain. They would have crossed canals on wooden bridges, past villages where farmers watched them curiously, and walked along the edges of fields where laborers bent over to tend barley. Nights were spent near rivers or wells when possible. The stars overhead served as guides, and there would be long stretches of silence, broken by the sound of wind over reeds and the occasional howl of a jackal. Leaving a city like Ur meant also leaving its gods. In Mesopotamia, gods were tied to specific cities. Temples were centers of both religious and economic power, and the relationship between people and their gods was transactional. Priests performed rituals to ensure good harvests and safe childbirth. In exchange, the gods were given offerings of grain, beer, and livestock. Abraham's family would have been familiar with these practices. To embark on a journey at the prompting of a single god, one who was not tied to a temple or a statue, represented a shift in religious thinking. It hinted at a relationship with the divine that was not mediated by priests in one place, but was portable. As the group moved westward, following trade routes through the Fertile Crescent, they encountered different landscapes. The flat floodplains of southern Mesopotamia gave way to rolling hills and rocky outcrops. They crossed rivers whose waters ran clear and cold compared to the silty flows of the Euphrates. They walked through groves of pistachio and almond trees, picking wild fruit for sustenance. Along the way, they would have met other travelers, merchants carrying tin and textiles, soldiers on patrol, and shepherds from other tribes. Exchanges took place in multiple languages. Sometimes there were disputes over grazing rights or water access, negotiated through gestures and gifts. At other times, there were shared meals and stories. Each new landscape, each negotiation, reinforced the sense of being on a path that few had taken voluntarily. The group built new memories together. Children who had been born in the city learned to sleep on blankets laid over packed earth and to wake with the sun. They learned to read the sky rather than the temple calendar. The journey itself forged a new kind of community identity, one that was less dependent on urban institutions and more on familial bonds, shared stories, and an emerging belief in a single guiding deity. This identity would grow and change over generations, but its seeds were planted in the long, slow departure from the city of Abraham's birth. The texture of this wandering life is worth lingering over. Days are organized not by clocks, but by the position of the sun and the feel of air on the skin. In spring, when rain falls softly on hard ground, grass shoots up in unexpected patches, and there is a sense of relief in the camp. Women kneel to gather herbs that have sprouted near stream beds, while children chase after lambs born minutes ago, their wool still slick from birth. Men check the condition of their herds, moving animals slowly so as not to overgraze new growth. They know each route intimately and can tell when another clan has been there recently by the condition of the scrub. Midsummer brings heat that is dry and unrelenting. Tents are pitched with their openings facing away from the noon sun, and during the hottest hours, people rest in the shade. Evenings at this time are precious. As the sky deepens to purple, the community gathers, sharing dates and goat's milk, while elders recall the names of ancestors. Stories passed down through generations are recited in a chant that rises and falls like the wind. They speak of spirits that inhabit springs and of the lessons learned when rain did not come on time. These tales are not indulgent. They serve as warnings and as bonds that hold the group together. When autumn arrives, the weather is cooler and the pace of travel slows. The community stops more often at wells to allow pregnant animals to drink. Adolescent boys practice their slinging skills on smooth stones, their eyes tracking the flight of birds that might be brought down for food. Women weave strips of wool on simple looms, the sound of the shuttle tapping in time with songs sung for hours. This is when clans visit one another. Gifts are exchanged: a clay pot for a cured hide, a handful of dried figs for a small copper knife, and alliances are renewed. Winter brings wind from the north. Nights are cold enough that frost forms on the edges of tent ropes. Fires burn all night, their embers carried from camp to camp in metal braziers. People sleep curled close together under thick blankets, listening to the howl of wolves across the plain. When someone dies in winter, the burial happens quickly. The body is wrapped, prayers are whispered, and stones are piled carefully to mark the place. It is understood that the living will return in the spring to sit and tell stories to the dead. Births are just as immediate and are often attended by women alone. A newborn's first cry is greeted with whispers and songs, and within hours the mother is walking again, her child strapped to her chest. The social fabric of these communities is woven from shared labor and mutual dependence. Decisions are made collectively, with elders representing extended families. There is no permanent leader. Respect is given to those who have proven themselves wise in judgment or brave in defending the group. Young people learn by watching and by doing. They are taught how to recognize tracks in the sand, how to find water by noting the flight of birds or the presence of certain plants, and how to fashion simple tools from bone and flint. Women teach their daughters to ferment milk into yogurt, to spin wool into yarn, and to treat sickness with herbs. Men teach their sons to negotiate with traders encountered on the edges of settlements and to handle animals with calm authority. Music is part of life, but not in the sense of grand performance. Simple flutes carved from reeds and drums made from stretched skins accompany songs that mark the milestones of life. There are songs to encourage a tired herd to keep moving, and songs to comfort a child frightened by a storm. At night, when the sky is clear, everyone lies back to look at the stars. The constellations are not just points of light, they are stories. The cluster we call the Pleiades is seen as a group of sisters who guide travelers. The bright belt of Orion becomes a hunter chasing his prey across the heavens. Children learn these stories early and internalize the routes by which their forebears moved. There are no written records at this stage. Memory is everything. To forget a path is to risk famine. To forget a story is to lose part of oneself. In a gentle rhythm that spans generations, the wanderers carry their world with them, not in the form of possessions, but as knowledge stored in minds and sung in the night. The entire story of the ancient Hebrews to relax, sleep too. In the quiet hours of the night, when streets empty and windows dim, a gentle narrative begins, anchored in the title you have chosen. This is the entire story of the ancient Hebrews, told in a way that encourages sleep without sacrificing detail. The pace is unhurried, like the slow passage of stars over a silent desert, and the tone remains steady. As you listen, you are invited to wander through long corridors of time, feeling the presence of lives lived long ago, tracing the paths of a people whose memory shaped vast stretches of history. Nothing here is rushed, and nothing is lost. The ancient hills and the voices of prophets are preserved in a whispering calm. Imagine a landscape before cities and kings. In a broad sweep of low hills and open plains, the earth is dry and dusty, the air carrying the faint scent of distant rains. Thick grass grows around watering holes, and flocks of sheep move slowly under the watch of shepherds who mark time by the passage of clouds. The people who will come to be known as Hebrews live as wanderers. They carry their homes with them, tents woven from wool and goat hair, warmed by coals and the low murmur of family voices. In the night sky, the constellations are clear, and over generations, parents teach children to read them as signs, a map that anchors their world in a vast expanse of stars. Life in this early period is marked by movement and by a constant awareness of weather and water. The paths between pastures are familiar, but the people rarely settle, bound by old habits of grazing and the need to keep flocks healthy. From within this roaming community, a figure arises who will shape a future identity. His name, in later memory, is Abraham. His story begins in a city of ancient Mesopotamia, where river reeds and brick-built temples dominate the skyline. He hears a call that is not described as thunderous, but as a persistent inner urging. "Leave," the voice suggests. "Walk to a land that will be given to your descendants." The decision, recorded in later telling as an act of faith, is also practical. Changing climate and shifting alliances make the homeland uncertain. Abraham gathers his family, their animals, and their few belongings. The procession is not grand. There are no chariots. There are donkeys loaded with household goods, children riding in slings, elders moving with care. They leave behind a land of fertile rivers and head toward an unknown region to the west. The journey is long. Along dusty roads, they pass cities with high walls, each full of languages they do not understand. They share meals by the road and sleep beneath the open sky, at times fearful of bandits or storms, and at times filled with wonder at the endless possibilities stretching ahead. The word Hebrew itself is thought to have meant wanderer. In the calm of the night, you can imagine these wanderers moving across the dry landscape. They are not yet defined by borders or by a state. Their identity rests in family stories and the memory of covenants made. Those covenants, according to later tradition, are solemn agreements between the people and a single divine presence. The central story tells that Abraham entered into a covenant with a God referred to simply as "I am who I am." In the story, the promise is twofold. The Hebrews will honor this God, and in return, they will be given a place of their own, a land described as flowing with milk and honey. The promise does not remove hardship, but it offers direction. Year after year, children are born into a sense of purpose tied to a landscape not yet fully theirs. The narrative stays with them like a melody passed down in families. It explains why they travel, why they refuse the idols of neighbors, why they keep to their own practices, even when among strangers. Abraham's family grows. His son Isaac and his grandson Jacob carry forward the experience of movement. Jacob's children are numerous, and among them is Joseph, whose story is emblematic of both suffering and survival. In this telling, Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers, a betrayal that hurts but ultimately leads to his rise in a foreign court. He finds himself in Egypt, a land of vast stone temples and meticulously plowed fields along the Nile. There he interprets dreams for a pharaoh who is troubled by visions of famine and plenty. Joseph's insight leads to storage of grain in years of abundance, and thus to Egypt's preparedness when drought strikes. Joseph's family, driven by hunger in their own lands, travels to Egypt and receives refuge because of his position. For a time, the Hebrews lived comfortably among the Egyptians, working in fields, tending animals, and trading along markets lined with incense and fresh fish. They enjoy the shade of palm trees and the reliability of the Nile's annual flood. Their children learn local customs and languages. The move from pastoral wandering to settlement in a fertile river valley marks a shift in lifestyle. They build homes of mud brick rather than tents, and they store grain instead of wandering for food. This relative stability continues for generations, and the memory of movement becomes remote. As time passes, changes in Egypt's own political landscape alter the Hebrews' position. New rulers rise who view the growing population of foreigners as a threat. Labor demands increase. In quiet villages along the river, Hebrew families find themselves conscripted to haul stones, to dig irrigation canals, to build storehouses and palaces. There is heavy work under the sun, calloused hands, and backs bowed from carrying bricks. The story that will be told later describes outright enslavement, a harsh transition from hospitable welcome to forced labor. Whether or not every element of that narrative reflects historical fact, it conveys a sense of collective memory of suffering in a land that is not home. Under these conditions, a leader emerges, Moses. He grows up in a courtly environment, but feels a connection to his people. According to tradition, he encounters the divine in the form of a burning bush that does not consume itself. The voice instructs him to lead his people out of bondage. Moses feels doubt, but eventually returns to speak to Pharaoh, to demand release. The story is filled with plague and negotiation, with hesitation, and with a final urgent departure on a night when the people eat unleavened bread because there is no time to let it rise. The departure from Egypt is remembered as the Exodus, and it represents the creation of a people forged through shared adversity and shaped by a law. As they leave, the Hebrews carry memories of the Nile's green banks and the taste of fish and onions, but they do not look back. They walk out into a wilderness of rock and sand. Days stretch into weeks and then into years. They camp at the foot of mountains, gather manna in the mornings, and drink water drawn from stone. They learn to live with scarcity and with the sense that their journey is both physical and spiritual. At the heart of this period is the giving of the law, a set of commands that instruct on ethical behavior and on the proper way to worship. The account tells of Moses climbing a mountain where thunder and smoke conceal the summit. He returns carrying stone tablets engraved with 10 foundational principles. The commandments ask them to honor the divine alone, to respect parents, to not kill or steal or bear false witness. In the story, the law is not just a list of rules. It is a path to community cohesion. Around shared fires, the people discuss what it means to live justly. They teach their children to recite these commandments as they travel. They mark them on doorposts and on small scrolls. The law becomes part of the rhythm of their days. 40 years of wandering in the wilderness is a long time. An entire generation lives and dies without seeing a settled home. Their children grow up with calloused feet and a knowledge of how to find shade in barren lands. They become resourceful, making use of herbs and desert plants, shaping tools from bone and stone. At night, elders tell stories of the ancestors who came from across the desert, of Joseph's rise in Egypt, and of the time when their own parents stood at the banks of the Red Sea and felt wind part the water. These stories are told in low voices, accompanied by the crackle of fire and the quiet of the open plain. They are tales meant to sustain hope. There is no hurry in their telling. They are repeated not for entertainment, but to keep the memory alive, to ensure that the identity of wanderers remains intact. When at last they approach the land described in the covenant, the Hebrews are no longer a small family. They are a confederation of tribes, 12 in number according to their memory, each with its own elders and traditions. They cross the river Jordan, carrying with them the Ark of the Covenant, a chest that holds the law and symbolizes their relationship to the divine. Entering the hill country of Canaan is not without conflict. There are cities with walls, farms with established owners, and other peoples with their own gods and customs. Some stories tell of battles, others of treaties, and still others of gradual assimilation. In the slow pace of our narrative, there is time to imagine the rhythm of life in the hills. Small villages are carved into terraces on slopes where olive trees grow. There is the sound of stone being chipped for tools and the smell of bread baking in clay ovens. Water is carried from springs in clay jars balanced on heads. At night, families gather on roofs to sleep under the stars because the houses below are too warm. There is a sense of belonging to the land itself. Each tribe is allotted a region, some in fertile valleys, others in mountainous terrain. They farm, they keep sheep and goats, they trade figs and pottery. They also come together at times of crisis to fight off raiders from the coast or from the desert. They have judges who rise to lead in times of need, individuals whose wisdom or courage is respected by many. These judges are not kings. They do not build palaces. They are more like elders who mediate disputes and rally their people when danger comes. Over time, pressures from neighboring peoples intensify. Along the coastal plain lives a group known as the Philistines. They are technologically advanced for the time with iron weapons and organized armies. Their presence and military strength make the tribal confederation of the Hebrews feel insufficient for defense. In quiet assembly, elders discuss the need for a different kind of leadership, something more stable than occasional judges. The people ask for a king. Their first king is Saul, chosen for his height and presence. Saul unites tribes, musters warriors, and faces the Philistines. Battles are fierce but often inconclusive. One story describes how the Ark of the Covenant is captured and later returned. Another story introduces David, a young shepherd who becomes a warrior. He is known for his harp and his bravery. In the famous tale, he faces a Philistine champion with only a sling and stones, winning a victory that changes his life. After Saul falls, David becomes king. He chooses Jerusalem, a hill town with natural defenses, as his capital. Jerusalem is small, perhaps a few thousand people, but its location is strategic. David brings the ark there and dances before it, celebrating the presence of the divine in the heart of his new city. The city, with narrow streets and stone houses, begins to grow. Craftsmen carve beams and fashion gates. Merchants bring goods from distant lands. Under David and then his son Solomon, the kingdom expands its borders and builds relationships with neighbors through trade and marriage. Solomon's reign is remembered for two things: wisdom and building. According to tradition, he judges disputes with insight, and visitors from as far as Sheba come to test his knowledge with riddles. He also builds the first temple in Jerusalem. The construction is massive for the time. Stones are cut and transported, wood is brought from distant forests, and skilled artisans craft gold and bronze implements. The temple stands as a central place of worship, a symbol of the Hebrews' covenant with their God. In front of its doors burn lamps with olive oil. Inside, incense fills the air. Priests in linen garments perform rituals, and people from across the kingdom travel to offer sacrifices. The temple's presence changes the religious landscape. Worship now has a focal point. Festivals are celebrated there. People feel connected to a central tradition. Solomon also builds palaces for his many wives and administrative officials. He constructs terraces and walls, and the city of Jerusalem grows in wealth and complexity. To support these projects, he imposes labor and taxes. One day in 3, according to the stories, some men work on royal projects. Trade with neighboring kingdoms brings prosperity, but also increases inequality. Some families gain wealth, others feel the burden of work and taxation. Solomon's policies create both pride and resentment. When Solomon dies, tensions among the tribes surface. The result is a division of the kingdom. 10 tribes in the north retain the name Israel, with their capital at Samaria. 2 tribes in the south form the kingdom of Judah, centered on Jerusalem. The separation is peaceful at first, but the 2 kingdoms diverge. Israel, larger and more cosmopolitan, engages with neighbors, trades widely, and in some cases adopts their customs. Judah remains smaller, more conservative, focused on preserving the exclusivity of worship at the temple. The people of Israel become known as Israelites, those in Judah as Jews, derived from the name of their kingdom. Each kingdom has its own kings, some just and some corrupt. Some leaders encourage the worship of multiple gods, aligning with local traditions. Others, influenced by a growing prophetic movement, call for exclusive devotion to Yahweh and for justice toward the poor and marginalized. The prophets are compelling figures, often outside the centers of power. They speak harshly against the wealthy and the complacent. They remind the people of their past as wanderers and call them to return to communal values. Their words echo through markets and along city walls, not in anger, but with a deep sadness that is felt even when told softly. Around the time of the prophets, the concept of monotheism matures. Previously, the Hebrews may have worshipped their God above others, but acknowledged the Yahweh existence of many deities. Henotheism, the worship of one God without denying the existence of others, gradually gives way to monotheism, the belief in a single, all-powerful deity. This transition is not abrupt. It is the result of decades of teaching, of the consolidation of sacred texts, and of historical events that challenge old assumptions. When the Assyrian Empire rises to dominance in the region, it demands that subject peoples, including the Israelites, acknowledge the Assyrian god Ashur. In the face of this pressure, Hebrew prophets insist that their own God is not just stronger, but the only real God. Their teachings begin to present the divine as omnipresent and universal. This idea is radical in the ancient world. It removes the gods from specific locations and makes moral behavior central to religious life. Monotheism grows as a response to external threats and internal inequality. It offers a sense of dignity to the poor and an ethical framework that holds everyone, including kings, accountable. Assyria's expansion has dire consequences. In 722 BCE, after a series of conflicts, the Assyrians conquer the northern kingdom of Israel. They deport many inhabitants to distant parts of the empire and bring in other peoples to resettle the land. The 10 tribes that had formed Israel are scattered. Over time, they lose their distinct identity. In later memory, they become the lost tribes. Refugees from the north flee to Judah, increasing the population of the southern kingdom. Judah holds out against Assyria, partly due to geography and partly because of a plague in the Assyrian army, but it becomes a vassal state. It pays tribute and accepts an Assyrian official in Jerusalem. Proud and protective of their independence, Judah's people oscillate between accommodating the empire and rebelling. Each rebellion leads to punitive action. Tensions remain high. The experience of being under foreign dominance deepens the appeal of prophets who call for social justice and exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. In the early 6th century BCE, the Neo-Babylonian Empire replaces Assyria as the major power. Judah rebels against Babylon and suffers a catastrophic response. In 586 BCE, Babylonian forces breach Jerusalem's walls after a siege. They burn the city and destroy the temple. The smoke from the burning of the cedar beams lingers for days. The walls of the temple crack and fall. Sacred items are taken as spoils. The ark, symbol of the covenant, disappears from the narrative at this point and is not mentioned again. The Babylonians carry tens of thousands of Judeans into exile. Families are forced to march east along roads they do not know, toward the city of Babylon with its tall ziggurats and broad avenues. They leave behind fields of olive trees and vineyards. In Babylon, they live beside rivers and canals. They remember the hills of Judah and the sound of the wind in the cedars. Among them are priests, scribes, and prophets. They meet to recall the stories of their ancestors to keep their identity alive. They compile sacred writings that will become the Torah. They emphasize the lessons of history, that infidelity to their God and injustice toward the poor lead to catastrophe. They dream of return and of rebuilding. They adapt to life in exile by developing practices that are not tied to a specific place. They make their homes places of worship. They teach their children to read the sacred texts. They eat foods prepared according to dietary laws. They marry within their community. The exile, a period of grief and longing, becomes a time of growth for the religion itself. 2 generations later, the Persian Empire, under Cyrus the Great, conquers Babylon. Cyrus is known for his policy of allowing exiled peoples to return home. He permits the Judeans to go back to their land, to rebuild their city, and to reconstruct the temple. Many accept the invitation. They travel back along the roads that once took them into exile. They cross deserts and fields, passing through cities that look both familiar and changed. They carry with them the texts compiled in Babylon, the new sense of monotheism, and the firm belief in an ethical, universal God. They arrive in a Jerusalem that is still in ruins. Stones are scattered, walls broken. Wild vines grow through cracks in pavements. With determination, they begin to clear rubble. They lay new foundations for the Second Temple. They rebuild homes. They reestablish farms on terraces. They share stories of their time in Babylon with those who had remained in Judah. Not everyone had gone into exile. Some had stayed and lived under foreign rule. There is tension at first between those who left and those who stayed, but over time a shared project emerges. The temple becomes the center of religious life again, but now the worship is informed by the lessons of exile. Scribes carefully copy the sacred texts. Scholars study them. Children learn to read and recite. The emphasis on textual study leads to the rise of a new class of teachers, eventually called rabbis. They interpret the law, answer questions, and guide the community. Even as they rebuild, the Judeans remain under Persian sovereignty. They are part of a vast empire that stretches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Indus Valley. They pay taxes and follow Persian laws. The Persian approach is relatively tolerant, and the Judeans are allowed to govern their own community according to their traditions. A governor or satrap oversees the province, but local elders have authority in daily matters. The community forms a council, the beginnings of the Sanhedrin, to handle legal and religious issues. The Persian period is one of relative peace and internal development. The people cultivate their land, plant orchards, and engage in trade. They maintain their traditions and adapt to new influences. They adopt the square Aramaic script for writing their language. Their religion continues to evolve with a growing emphasis on ethical conduct, study, and communal worship. Synagogues begin to appear as places of gathering, teaching, and prayer outside the temple. These synagogues provide a network of spiritual and social centers that will be critical in later periods when the temple is gone. In the late 4th century BCE, the landscape of power in the region changes once again. Alexander the Great, a young king from Macedonia, conquers the Persian Empire. His armies move swiftly, spreading Greek culture, language, and ideas across the ancient world. After his death, his empire fragments. Judea comes under the control of the Ptolemies of Egypt, and later the Seleucid kings of Syria. Under the Ptolemies, Jewish communities in Judea and in the diaspora flourish. Greek becomes a common language. Alexandria becomes a center of Jewish scholarship, where the Hebrew scriptures are translated into Greek in a version known as the Septuagint. Jews engage with Greek philosophy and science while retaining their distinct identity. In Judea, life under the Ptolemies is relatively stable. The economy grows and the population expands. In the 2nd century BCE, control shifts to the Seleucid Empire, and with it comes increasing pressure to adopt Hellenistic culture. Greek cities in Judea are built with theaters, gymnasiums, and temples dedicated to Greek gods. Some Jews embrace Hellenism, attracted by the broader Mediterranean culture, the promise of citizenship, and the benefits of trade. They participate in athletic games, adopt Greek names, and incorporate Greek customs into their lives. Others are cautious or resistant. For them, Greek art, nude athleticism, and veneration of human form conflict with their tradition. The presence of a gymnasium next to the temple in Jerusalem, where one must exercise naked, feels like a direct assault on modesty and on covenantal practices such as circumcision. The tension between those who welcome Hellenism and those who resist it creates deep divisions within the community. The Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes intensifies the conflict. His goal is to unify his diverse realm through enforced Hellenization. He imposes decrees that restrict Jewish religious practices. Circumcision, Sabbath observance, and dietary laws are outlawed. He erects statues of Greek gods and sacrifices to Zeus on the altar in the temple. For many Jews, these acts are intolerable. In the town of Modian, a Jewish priest named Mattathias refuses to offer sacrifice to a Greek idol. When another man steps forward to comply, Mattathias kills him and the Seleucid official overseeing the ceremony. He calls out to the gathered crowd, inviting those who are zealous for the law and the covenant to follow him. This act sparks a revolt. Mattathias and his 5 sons, John, Simon, Judah, Eleazar, and Jonathan, flee to the hills. They become guerrilla fighters. They are known as the Maccabees, from the Hebrew word for hammer. Their followers include farmers, shepherds, and artisans. They are poorly armed but determined. They know the landscape intimately, using hill paths and valleys for ambushes. They attack Seleucid garrisons, tear down idols, and enforce adherence to the traditional law. Stories tell of how Judah Maccabee defeats larger and better equipped armies through surprise tactics and knowledge of the terrain. In 165 BCE, they retake Jerusalem. They find the temple defiled, its courtyard filled with rubble and idol fragments. They clean it, rebuild the altar, and rededicate it. The rededication, according to tradition, involves the miracle of oil that burns for 8 days, even though it is sufficient for only 1. This event is commemorated in the festival of Hanukkah, a time of light in the darkest part of the year. After the victory, the Maccabees establish a dynasty known as the Hasmonean. For the first time since the division of the kingdom, Judea is independent. The new rulers expand the territory, forcefully incorporating neighboring regions and, in some cases, compelling conversion. They take on the role of both kings and high priests, blending political and religious authority. Their policies reflect a mix of traditional practices and Hellenistic influence. They mint coins, build fortresses, and maintain a standing army. Over time, internal conflicts arise. Different factions vie for power. Some align with the Pharisees, who emphasize strict adherence to the law and oral traditions. Others align with the Sadducees, who control the temple and maintain relations with foreign powers. Meanwhile, the influence of Hellenism remains strong. Greek language and culture continue to permeate daily life. The independent kingdom lasts for about a century. Its internal divisions weaken it, and external pressures increase. In 63 BCE, the Roman general Pompey intervenes in Judean affairs, siding with one claimant over another in a Hasmonean civil war. He enters Jerusalem, and Judea becomes a client state of Rome. Roman control is both direct and indirect. They install client kings, collect taxes, and maintain garrisons. Herod the Great, one of the most famous of these client kings, rules with both brutality and building prowess. He expands the Second Temple, making it one of the largest religious structures of the ancient world. His expansion includes massive retaining walls that create a platform, the Temple Mount. He builds port cities, fortresses, and palaces. Despite these achievements, his reign is marked by fear, executions, and heavy taxes. He is also seen by many as a collaborator with foreign oppressors. After Herod's death, Roman procurators govern Judea directly. They are often harsh and insensitive to local customs. They use temple funds for secular projects, appoint high priests without regard for religious qualifications, and sometimes place images of the emperor in public spaces, offending Jewish sensitivities. The population is diverse. Some Jews are fully integrated into Greco-Roman culture. Others isolate themselves, living in ascetic communities in the desert. Various sects interpret the law differently, leading to different expectations of the future. Some, like the Essenes, retreat into small communes and await divine intervention. Others, like the Pharisees, focus on the study of law and daily obedience. The Zealots, a group of militants, see armed resistance as the only way to regain sovereignty. Tensions build in Jerusalem. In 66 CE, a combination of factors ignites revolt. Corrupt administrators, heavy taxation, religious disrespect, and the plundering of the temple by the Roman procurator Gessius Florus push the population beyond endurance. In Caesarea, violence breaks out between Greeks supported by Rome and Jews. In Jerusalem, zealots kill Roman soldiers and collaborators. The revolt spreads quickly. Rebel forces take control of much of Judea and Galilee. Roman legions from Syria are sent to restore order, but suffer a serious defeat at the hands of Judean fighters at the pass of Beth Horon. The Romans regroup. The Emperor Nero sends the general Vespasian, accompanied by his son Titus, to crush the rebellion. They advance systematically, recapturing Galilee and moving south. They besiege Jerusalem in 70 CE. Inside the city, factions of rebels fight among themselves, burning each other's food supplies in a misguided attempt to force total war. Starvation sets in. Outside, Roman engineers build siege works. They batter the walls with rams and catapults. After months, they breach the defenses. Rome's legions pour into the city. They burn buildings, loot treasures, and kill or enslave inhabitants. The temple is set on fire. Flames rise from the courts. Gold melts and runs between the stones. The ancient heart of Judean worship is destroyed. The Roman victory is complete. Thousands are killed, and survivors are taken as slaves. Some are forced to build the great amphitheater in Rome. Others are scattered across the empire. Without the temple, the religion transforms. Rabbis and synagogues become central. The emphasis shifts fully to study, prayer, and community acts. The physical heart of worship is gone, but the spiritual heart continues. This transformation ensures survival in diaspora. Jewish communities spread across the Roman world from Alexandria to Rome, from Babylon to Spain. They maintain rituals and texts. They adapt to local cultures while preserving a distinct identity. The destruction of the temple does not end the desire for autonomy. In 132 CE, under the Roman Emperor Hadrian, tensions flare again. Hadrian plans to build a Roman colony, Aelia Capitolina, on the site of Jerusalem. He bans circumcision, planning to suppress Jewish religious expression. Mismanagement by local officials, including the governor Tinius Rufus, aggravates tensions. Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic leader, emerges. He is proclaimed by some as the Messiah, expected to restore Israel. He leads a well-organized rebellion. At first, the Egeian rebels achieve success. They establish an independent state, mint coins, and rebuild infrastructure. For a brief period, there is a sense of hope. They fortify towns and hideouts in caves. Roman forces respond methodically. The general Julius Severus is sent with reinforcements. He avoids direct confrontation at first, cutting supply lines and isolating strongholds. One by one, he retakes territory. The siege of the fortress of Bedr is long and bloody. When it falls in 135 CE, Bar Kokhba is killed. The rebellion collapses. After suppressing the revolt, Rome imposes severe penalties. Jews are banned from Jerusalem. Aelia Capitolina is built with a temple to Jupiter where the Jewish temple once stood. The province is renamed Syria Palestina, an attempt to erase Jewish identity. Many Jews are killed, others sold into slavery. Those who survive disperse even further across the empire. The diaspora becomes not just a temporary exile, but a permanent condition. Communities in Mesopotamia, North Africa, Spain, and elsewhere continue to develop. They follow the rhythm of rabbinic teaching, the reading of the Torah, the observance of festivals. They pray toward Jerusalem, which they cannot enter. They tell stories of the land, keeping memory alive. Life under the monarchy introduces new rhythms and responsibilities. Saul, David, and Solomon are names that echo, but between the kings and the common folk lies a broad landscape of daily tasks. After Saul rallies the tribes against the Philistines, he still depends on local clans to tend flocks and plant fields. The early monarchy lacks a standing army or a permanent bureaucracy. Men are called to arms when needed and return to plows once danger passes. Women continue to grind grain, to weave linen, to teach children the stories of ancestors. Under David, Jerusalem becomes more than a hill town. The arrival of artisans and builders brings new skills. Streets are paved with stone. Gates are reinforced. A palace rises with cedar beams from Lebanon, its rooms arranged around central courtyards. In these spaces, officials learn to keep records. Scribes sharpen reeds and dip them into ink made from gallnuts. They write on parchment and papyrus, keeping lists of tribute and stores of grain. The existence of a central court creates both opportunity and burden. Craftsmen find employment in building projects. Traders bring spices and metals to the city, exchanging them for olive oil and wine. Musicians are hired to perform at banquets, their melodies winding through halls lit by oil lamps. At the same time, the demand for labor and resources increases. The road to Jerusalem becomes busy with carts laden with timber and stone. Farmers sometimes find their sons conscripted for months to haul blocks or dig foundations. In villages far from the capital, life remains grounded in the seasons. Each spring, men clear terraces and prune vines. Children chase lambs around pens. Elders gather in the shade of olive trees to discuss events in the kingdom. They may not have seen the temple, but they hear of its splendor, columns clad in gold, a curtain dyed deep blue. During festivals, some travel to the city, bringing offerings wrapped in cloth. They walk through gates and see the smoke of sacrifices rising. Priests in linen robes chant prayers while the scent of incense fills the air. They return home with stories of the capital, describing markets where traders speak foreign tongues and where one can buy jewelry of finely hammered gold. Under Solomon, the organization of labor becomes more systematized. Officials divide the land into districts. Each district supplies provisions for the king's table 1 month of the year. Families feel pride when their produce is chosen. They also feel the strain. The temple's construction requires thousands of workers. Some cut timber in distant forests, others chisel stone in quarries. The work is heavy and monotonous, but there is also a sense of participating in something that will endure. When the temple is dedicated, pilgrims gather from across the kingdom. They hear the sounding of trumpets, see priests carrying the ark into the inner sanctuary, and watch Solomon standing on a raised platform, praying for wisdom and justice. After the dedication, life resumes its ordinary pace. Goats still need milking, grain still needs threshing, clouds still gather over the hills, promising or withholding rain. The monarchy brings a new level of organization, but it does not erase the intimacy of everyday tasks. In this period, law and custom continue to evolve. Judges still operate in towns, adjudicating disputes. The elders on benches outside the gate decide cases of inheritance and injury. Scribes record decisions, slowly building a written corpus of precedent. Poets compose songs about kings and about the divine presence dwelling in Zion. The book of Samuel and the early chapters of Kings suggest an awareness that leadership is both a gift and a temptation. Samuel warns the people that a king will take their sons and daughters, their fields and vineyards. Some ignore the warning. Others remember. The monarchy becomes part of the collective memory, cherished for the unity it brings, but also viewed critically when it concentrates wealth and power. Amid the institutions of kingship emerges a different voice, that of the prophets. They are not fortune tellers in the modern sense, they are interpreters of covenantal ethics. They speak against oppression, against the accumulation of riches at the expense of the poor. Amos is a herdsman and a dresser of sycamore figs. He leaves his home and travels to cities to warn that sacrifices are meaningless without justice. In his vision, he sees a plumb line held by the divine, measuring whether walls are straight. He calls out the comfortable women of Samaria as cows of Bashan for reclining on couches while the needy are sold for sandals. Hosea uses the metaphor of an unfaithful marriage to describe how the people have strayed after other gods. Isaiah walks barefoot through the streets of Jerusalem as a sign of impending exile, and then later describes a vision of peace where swords become plowshares and lions lie down with lambs. Micah declares that what is required of humanity is to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. These voices do not speak from thrones. They often come from the margins, calling kings and priests to account. Their words are preserved not to condemn, but to guide. They remind the community that rituals alone are insufficient and that ethical behavior toward neighbors is central. Monotheism, as we understand it, does not emerge fully formed in this period. Early worship allows for the existence of other gods, but emphasizes a special relationship with one deity. Over time, as prophets critique the blending of rituals and as political crises deepen, the notion of one universal deity takes root. This shift is gradual. It involves reinterpretation of earlier stories, composition of new prayers, and reflection during times of catastrophe. The fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria is one such catastrophe. When Samaria falls, survivors flee to Judah, bringing with them scrolls and oral traditions. The people of Judah see the destruction of their sister kingdom as a warning. The prophets interpret it as the consequence of injustice and idolatry. Their warnings grow more urgent, though their tone remains measured in our telling. The Babylonian conquest brings a new phase. In 586 BCE, the temple is destroyed, walls crumble, fire consumes cedar beams, priests are killed, and the ark disappears from history. The king is blinded and taken away in chains. The elite craftsmen, scribes, and warriors are deported to Babylon. Those who remain till fields that have been scorched, trying to coax life from a devastated land. The exiles sit by the rivers of Babylon and weep when they remember Zion. They hang their harps on willow trees because they cannot bring themselves to sing songs of Jerusalem in a foreign land. But life continues. In Babylon, they adapt. They learn the language of their captors. They work as artisans, merchants, and bureaucrats. Some become successful. They build houses, plant gardens, take spouses, and have children, as advised by the prophet Jeremiah. They also gather on Sabbaths to read scrolls and share memories. They write down stories that had been told orally, accounts of creation, of Abraham, of Exodus. They compile genealogies. The experience of exile deepens the focus on written tradition. Without a temple, the community turns to scripture and to the observance of festivals in homes. The Sabbath becomes a day of gathering, of study and rest. Synagogues, initially informal assemblies, begin to form. In Babylon, new texts reflect new experiences. Lamentations expresses grief in acrostic form, each verse beginning with a successive letter of the Hebrew alphabet. Ezekiel has visions by the river Chebar, of wheels within wheels and cherubim with faces of lion, ox, eagle, and human. These images are strange and complex, hinting at a cosmic order beyond human understanding. He also speaks of a heart of stone being replaced with a heart of flesh, a promise of renewal. The exiles adopt Aramaic as a lingua franca, and some texts are written in it. But they maintain Hebrew for prayer. When news comes that Cyrus, king of Persia, has conquered Babylon and issued an edict allowing exiles to return, reactions are mixed. Some have grown comfortable in Babylon. Others long to see Jerusalem. Those who choose to return embark on a journey back across the desert, echoing earlier wanderings. They carry with them scrolls, memories, and a determination to rebuild. The return under Persian rule is marked by both hope and challenge. The province of Yehud is small and impoverished. The Temple Mount is a heap of rubble. The first returnees set up an altar amid the ruins, offering sacrifices amid charred stones. They lay foundations for a new temple, but local opposition and imperial bureaucracy delay construction. Years pass. Prophets like Haggai and Zechariah encourage rebuilding, urging people not to be discouraged by the modest size of the new structure compared to Solomon's temple. Slowly, the Second Temple rises. It is less grand, but it becomes a focal point once more. The Persian administration permits a degree of autonomy. Governors like Zerubbabel oversee building. Scribes like Ezra arrive later with copies of the law. Ezra gathers the people and reads aloud from the Torah, explaining it so that all can understand. This public reading becomes a model for later synagogue services. Life in Yehud blends continuity and change. Farmers cultivate barley and vines on terraced hillsides. Shepherds graze flocks in the Judean wilderness. Artisans craft pottery and weave fabrics. At festivals, pilgrims come to Jerusalem, bringing offerings and celebrating together. At the same time, Persian influence is present. Aramaic becomes the language of trade and administration. Coins bear images of Persian rulers. The calendar is adjusted. The role of priests becomes more prominent as the temple is central. The high priest, appointed from certain families, wields religious authority and increasingly political influence. The community continues to grapple with intermarriage and assimilation. Ezra and Nehemiah emphasize separation to maintain identity. Yet daily interactions with other peoples are a fact of life. Markets are shared. Wells are shared. In the quiet of the evening, as the sun sets over the hill country, families sit on rooftops, looking out at the ruins and the newly laid stones, aware that they live in a liminal time between devastation and rebuilding. After Alexander the Great's conquests, a new cultural tide reaches Yehud. Greek becomes the language of administration and commerce across the eastern Mediterranean. City-states organized along Greek lines are founded. Gymnasiums, where youths exercise and study rhetoric, appear in some towns. Jewish communities wrestle with how much of this Hellenistic culture to adopt. Some embrace the new language, reading and translating their sacred texts into Greek. The Septuagint is produced in Alexandria, making the law accessible to those who no longer know Hebrew. Philosophical ideas from Plato and Aristotle enter debates. Jewish thinkers like Philo attempt to harmonize Greek philosophy and Jewish scripture. In everyday life, Hellenistic influence manifests in clothing styles, architecture, and education. Men wear tunics of lighter fabric and sandals with straps that wrap around the calf. Houses in cities are built with colonnaded courtyards. Women participate in musical contests and attend theater performances. At the same time, traditional practices continue. Circumcision, dietary laws, and Sabbath observance remain markers of identity. Some families send their sons to Greek schools. Others teach them in community study houses. The tension between adaptation and resistance grows when Seleucid rulers push for uniformity. Antiochus IV's decrees against Jewish practices catalyzed the revolt, led by the family of priests from Modi'in. The Maccabean uprising is both a religious and a cultural struggle. It affirms the right to live differently within a Hellenistic world. The Hasmonean kingdom that follows the revolt is complex. On one hand, it represents renewed sovereignty. Judea mints its own coins and expands its territory. On the other, the Hasmonean rulers adopt aspects of Hellenistic kingship, taking Greek titles and engaging in territorial wars. John Hyrcanus and his sons conquer Idumea and the Transjordan, sometimes forcing conversions. Aristobulus IV declares himself king and high priest, combining offices that were previously separate. Alexander Jannaeus expands the realm but faces internal revolt. The Pharisees emphasize oral law and piety. The Sadducees maintain aristocratic control of the temple. The Essens withdraw to the desert, forming communal societies where they purify themselves and await an imminent end of days. Within homes, these sectarian divisions may seem distant. People still plant and harvest. They grind barley and bake bread. They observe festivals, telling the story of the rededication of the temple each winter, lighting lamps one by one to commemorate the miracle of oil. They circumcise their sons, teach them to read, and remind them of the covenant. They navigate taxes and trade, sometimes paying levies to Hasmonean soldiers and sometimes to neighboring kingdoms. The temple, rebuilt and expanded, is the spiritual center. Pilgrims ascend to Jerusalem 3 times a year, singing songs of ascent. They buy animals for sacrifice in markets, exchange currency with money changers, and bathe in ritual pools. On major feast days, the city fills with thousands. The sound of shofars carries over rooftops. In quieter times, life along the Jordan or near the Sea of Galilee is peaceful. Fishermen cast nets at dawn. Women fetch water from springs. Children chase each other among fig trees. When Rome enters the scene, the political landscape shifts again. Herod the Great, although born in Idumea, is appointed king by Rome and marries into the Hasmonean family. His building projects transform the land. In Jerusalem, he expands the Temple Mount. Massive retaining walls are built with stones so large that later generations will marvel at their placement. The platform now covers a vast area with colonnades along the sides and courts for women, men, and priests. In Caesarea Maritima, he constructs a deep-water port using hydraulic concrete with a theater and hippodrome. At Masada and Herodium, desert fortresses rise, complete with water cisterns, bathhouses, and mosaic floors. His palace in Jericho includes sunken gardens and frescoes. These projects create employment for thousands. They also impose heavy taxes. Many families find their land seized to pay debts. Herod's rule is notorious for paranoia. He kills his wife Mariamne and several of his sons, fearing conspiracies. Nonetheless, he maintains stability and keeps Rome satisfied. Under Roman administration after Herod's death, Judea becomes a province governed by prefects and procurators. Soldiers patrol roads and stand guard at fortresses. Legionaries are stationed in Caesarea and at the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem. Roman engineers maintain roads that link cities. Taxes are collected in coin, and census data is recorded. Greek and Latin mingle with Aramaic and Hebrew in markets. In Galilee, carpenters and fishermen like Joseph and his son build and repair. In the wilderness near the Dead Sea, a group of scribes copy scrolls and hide them in caves. Their community at Qumran practices ascetic rituals and awaits a teacher of righteousness. Pharisees discuss interpretations of the law in synagogues, while Sadducees administer sacrifices in the temple. Zealots train in secret, gathering weapons. Essenes retreat further into the desert. The diversity of thought and practice is remarkable. During the Great Revolt of 66-70 CE, everyday life is upended. In the lead-up, families debate whether to rebel or to continue accommodating Rome. In villages, men sharpen blades and hide them in threshing floors. Some join zealots, others hope for peace. When fighting begins, roads become dangerous. Roman patrols are ambushed. Villages are burned, sometimes by Romans, sometimes by rebels punishing those deemed collaborators. Fields are trampled. In Jerusalem during the siege, starvation sets in. Mothers cannot feed their children. Factions within the city burn each other's food stores. believing that desperate conditions will compel divine intervention. The horror is immense, but there are also acts of quiet kindness. People share scraps of bread. Elders tell stories to calm frightened children. After the temple is destroyed, survivors flee. Some make their way to Yavne, where a sage named Johanan ben Zakkai establishes a school. Others head to Galilee. The structure of worship shifts. Without altars, prayers and study become the primary offerings. Houses become places of gathering. The emphasis on law leads to the compilation of the Mishnah centuries later. Rabbinic Judaism, rooted in interpretation and debate, emerges from this period. The Bar Kokhba revolt decades later further demonstrates both resilience and tragedy. In caves of the Judean hills, families hide with provisions. Letters from this time reveal ordinary concerns, requests for palm branches for lulav rituals, inventories of weapons, lists of debts. Bar Kokhba issues coins with images of the temple facade and the words for the freedom of Jerusalem. People believe that sovereignty can be restored. For a while, an independent administration operates. Land is redistributed. Rituals are maintained. Hope flickers. Then the Roman response overwhelms. Hadrian's legions systematically isolate strongholds. Hunger and disease ravage communities. After the fall of Betar, the devastation is thorough. Bodies lie unburied. Survivors are sold into slavery. Yet among those who escape, there is again adaptation. They settle in villages in the Galilee, in the Golan, in Syria. They establish schools. They recount what happened in the revolt. They reinterpret prophetic verses to find meaning. Over time, the memory of Bar Kokhba shifts from national heroism to cautionary tale about false messiahs. Diaspora life after these rebellions is not uniform. In Babylon, communities thrive. They establish academies at Sura and Pumbedita. Rabbis debate interpretations of the law, building the Talmud. In Alexandria, a cosmopolitan city with a large Jewish population, Greek and Hebrew cultures merge. Philosophers engage in debates about the nature of the divine. In Rome, a Jewish quarter forms across the Tiber. Artisans carve inscriptions in catacombs. Merchants sell wool and spices. They pay taxes to local authorities and send funds to support the community in Jerusalem when permitted. In Spain, under later Islamic rule, Jewish poets write in Arabic and Hebrew, exploring themes of love and exile. They serve as translators, physicians, and financiers. In Yemen, small communities tend fields on terraced mountainsides. They sing poems about Zion in the evenings. Across these communities, certain threads remain. The Sabbath continues as a weekly sanctuary in time. Synagogues, whether carved into rock or built of mud bricks, face Jerusalem. Torah scrolls are wrapped in cloth and adorned with crowns. Children learn the alphabet and begin to chant verses. Weddings take place under canopies with cups of wine and songs. Burial societies ensure dignity for the dead. Laws regarding kashrut guide what is cooked and eaten. Prayers for rain are recited in appropriate seasons. Messengers carry news between far-flung communities. A sense of belonging to a people and a covenant persists, even without a shared homeland. The idea of return remains in liturgy and in lullabies. Each year at Passover, families recite, "Next year in Jerusalem." The concept of Jerusalem becomes both a physical city and a symbol of hope and wholeness. In this way, the story of the ancient Hebrews extends beyond the borders of any one kingdom. It is lived in fields and markets, in deserts and cities, in palaces and in huts. It is carried in the melodies of psalms, in the lines of law, and in the whispered names of judges, kings, prophets, and rebels. It is shaped by the hands that build temples and by the hands that rebuild after destruction. It is told by parents to children as they settle down to sleep, by teachers to students in schools, by travelers to strangers around campfires. it is a story of continuity and change, of resilience and reflection. As centuries pass, the descendants of the ancient Hebrews will experience further migrations, persecutions, and revivals. They will live under Islamic rule, under Christian kings, under various empires. Their story will continue beyond the time frame of this narrative. It will include flourishing in places like Baghdad, Cordoba, and later Amsterdam. It will include tragedies in other places. But through all of this, the foundational experiences of wandering, covenant, law, kingdom, exile, return, and diaspora remain at the core. The memory of Abraham's journey, of standing at Sinai, of building and losing the temple, of exile by the rivers of Babylon, of resistance against Hellenization, of the rededication of the temple, of the Roman sieges, and of the Bar Kokhba revolt shapes their identity. The ethical teachings that emerged from the prophetic movement, care for the poor, equality before God, the universality of justice, continue to resonate. The monotheism that developed in ancient Judah becomes central not only to Judaism, but also to Christianity and Islam, profoundly influencing global history. In the Nile's first cataract, on an island near Elephantine, another chapter unfolds. Here, in the 5th century BCE, a community of Judeans serves in the garrison of the Persian Empire. They build a temple to their deity alongside those dedicated to the Egyptian god Khnum. Their houses are made of mud brick, their roofs covered with palm logs. Women draw water from the Nile in clay jars and sell fish and bread in markets that smell of roasted onions and cumin. Men write letters on papyrus to officials in Jerusalem, requesting permission to rebuild their temple after local priests have damaged it. They sign their names in Aramaic, sometimes using Egyptian theophoric elements. Their correspondence reveals daily concerns, debts owed, dowries to be returned, the need for permission to celebrate Passover. We glimpse their world through the texture of papyrus and the formal salutations of their letters. We see how the memory of Jerusalem persists even in an Egyptian border town, how rituals adapt to a new context, and how identity is negotiated between imperial duties and ancestral devotion. Further north, in the cosmopolitan city of Alexandria, a library rises that aims to contain all the world's knowledge. Under high ceilings lined with scrolls, scholars from different cultures meet. In a calm corner, 70 elders from Judea are said to undertake a monumental task, translating their sacred texts into Greek. The Septuagint, as it comes to be called, allows Jews who no longer speak Hebrew to read the law. It also opens these texts to Greek philosophers. The translation process itself becomes a story, told later with reverence. Some say that each translator worked separately and yet all produced identical versions, a sign of divine approval. Beyond the legend, the act of translation marks a new stage. Greek words carry nuances that Hebrew does not, and vice versa. New philosophical questions arise. How to describe the ineffable name of the divine, how to render poetry filled with wordplay. In this process, the texts themselves become bridges between worlds, allowing a young person in Alexandria to read about shepherds in Canaan and to feel part of that ancient story. Eastward along the Euphrates, scholars gather in houses of study. In the academies of Sura and Pumbedita, generations after the destruction of the temple, a new form of learning emerges. Students sit on woven mats in a circle. In the center, a teacher recites a passage of the Mishnah. He pauses and debates begin. One student offers an interpretation, another challenges it. Voices are soft but firm. The conversation is not linear, but like a woven tapestry, with threads returning to earlier statements, tying in references from Scripture and from previous generations of teachers. Outside, date palms rustle in the breeze. Merchants pass by with caravans of wool and spices headed toward distant markets. The scholar's day is structured: morning prayers, study, a simple meal, more study, an evening stroll along the river. The Talmud that arises from these discussions is not just a law code, it is a record of collective thought. It includes debates, stories, ethical admonitions, and humor. Reading it is like entering a room where voices from across centuries speak. Synagogues become central in these communities. The word itself means assembly. The architecture varies. In Babylon, a synagogue might be a simple room with benches along the walls and a niche facing west toward Jerusalem. In Sardis, or Dura Europos, synagogues are decorated with frescoes of zodiac signs and biblical scenes. In the Galilee, basalt stones are carved into columns and lintels. At the front of each synagogue, an ark holds scrolls wrapped in embroidered cloths. Lamps hang from beams, casting a warm glow on the faces of congregants. During services, a reader chants from the Torah in a melodic pattern that echoes the cadence of ancient songs. Another translates into Aramaic for those who do not understand Hebrew. Children whisper questions to their parents about the meaning of a verse. After the reading, someone stands to deliver a drash, an interpretation. The community listens, nodding in agreement or murmuring softly when a familiar passage yields a new insight. Afterward, they share bread and fruit in the courtyard. Outside the walls of the synagogue, life is filled with trades and crafts, but within, time slows, and attention focuses on words and their meanings. The letters from Elephantine and the papyri from other communities reveal how identity is negotiated in writing. Marriage contracts stipulate the bride's rights. Loan documents detail collateral and interest. Even mundane lists of dates and measurements tell a story of careful record-keeping. In some documents, the divine name is abbreviated or written in Paleo-Hebrew script to set it apart from the surrounding Aramaic. In others, blessings are offered to local rulers alongside prayers for Jerusalem. These texts show that being an Israelite in diaspora does not mean isolation. It means interaction with courts, with neighbors, with bureaucracy. It means learning to express loyalty to an empire while maintaining loyalty to an ancestral covenant. Reading these papyri, one senses the quiet diligence required to sustain a community. The scribe sharpening his reed pen, the woman weaving a basket, the elder ensuring that the Passover lamb is prepared according to custom. Trade routes connect these communities. Caravans travel along the Silk Road carrying spices, silk, and precious stones. Merchants from Judea, Babylon, and Arabia meet at caravanserais, sharing news over bowls of stew. Letters travel with them, folded and sealed with clay. A father in Susa writes to his son in Jerusalem about the price of wool. A scholar in Alexandria sends a query to Babylon about a difficult passage in Ezekiel. A marriage is arranged between families in different cities, with gifts sent ahead. The Mediterranean Sea also carries ships laden with grain and wine. Jewish sailors, knowledgeable about wines and currents, guide vessels between ports. In each port city, Alexandria, Ostia, Carthage, there is a Jewish quarter. It includes a market, a synagogue, a bathhouse. Festivals are celebrated on different days according to local moon sightings, but the prayers and songs are similar. Travelers recognize melodies and join in. The connectivity fosters a sense of belonging that transcends geography. The composition of the Talmud is not the only intellectual pursuit. In Alexandria, Philo blends Greek philosophy with Jewish tradition, using allegory to interpret Scripture. He writes about the Logos, the divine reason that orders the cosmos. He describes how the soul should ascend from the sensible world to the intelligible. His works influence later Christian thinkers, but within his own community, they provide a framework for engaging with Greek thought without abandoning faith. Other writers compose hymns and poems. The Wisdom of Solomon, written in Greek, reflects on the nature of immortality and justice. Ben Sira composes proverbs about humility, friendship, and the pursuit of wisdom. These writings, though not part of later Hebrew canon, are read and cherished. They reveal a world where boundaries between cultures are permeable. The early movement of Jesus of Nazareth emerges within this complex Jewish environment. His teachings of compassion, of turning the other cheek, of loving one's neighbor as oneself, are deeply rooted in Hebrew Scripture. His followers, initially all Jews, attend synagogues and observe the Sabbath. Over time, as they accept non-Jewish adherents without requiring circumcision, differences arise. The destruction of the temple intensifies these differences. One branch of Jews continues along the rabbinic path, developing law and ritual. Another branch emphasizes faith in Jesus as the path to salvation. The parting is slow, and for centuries, communities overlap. The letters of Paul of Tarsus, written to assemblies in Corinth and Ephesus, reflect debates about dietary laws and observance of festivals. These debates are gentle in our telling. They show how shared roots can lead to different branches, each seeking to understand the divine and the role of humanity in the world. Philosophical exploration continues in diaspora settings. In Tiberias, sages reflect on cosmology, pondering how the world was created and how it will end. In Nehardia, rabbis discuss free will and divine foreknowledge. They refer to Plato's allegory of the cave and to Aristotle's categories while grounding their arguments in Scripture. Knowledge circulates along with goods. Translators work not only on Scripture, but on scientific texts, bringing Greek medicine to Persian lands and Indian numerals to the Mediterranean. Jewish physicians serve in courts from Baghdad to Cordoba, studying anatomy and preparing remedies with herbs and resins. They write treatises that will later be translated into Latin. Their work is grounded in careful observation, the same attentiveness that characterizes their reading of sacred text. Diaspora communities navigate their identities through time. In some places, like Antioch, they gain citizenship and build ornate synagogues with mosaic floors depicting Noah's Ark and the sacrifice of Isaac. In others, like Rome, they face restrictions, barred from certain professions, but allowed to maintain self-governance. In some villages, they live among pagans, in others, among Christians, in still others, among Zoroastrians. They develop liturgies that incorporate local melodies. They tell stories about Daniel in the lion's den, about Esther saving her people, about Judith beheading Holofernes. These stories emphasize courage and resourcefulness. When persecutions occur, they respond by strengthening communal bonds, organizing charities, and creating codes of conduct. At times, they relocate en masse, moving from one region to another, carrying scrolls, candlesticks, and memory. Throughout these centuries, the idea of Jerusalem remains central. Even when actual return is impossible, Jerusalem lives in imagination and in prayer. Poets compose laments comparing the city to a widow. Others envision its future restoration in glowing terms. On Tisha B'Av, communities fast and read lamentations by candlelight. They sit on low stools or on the floor, swaying as they chant the Hebrew alphabet acrostic. The room is dim. Outside, in the heat of summer, cicadas chirp. Inside, the rhythm of the chant and the flicker of candles create a sense of being suspended in time. After the fast, people rise slowly, tasting cool water and sweet dates, remembering that mourning and hope are intertwined. The continual act of telling and retelling is itself a form of preservation. Fathers teach sons the precise hand motions for laying tefillin. Mothers show daughters how to braid challah and light candles. Teachers introduce students to the shapes of letters and the melodies of prayers. Elders recall journeys and share them with those who have never seen the land of Israel. Scribes copy texts with reverence, counting letters, ensuring that no word is missing. When scrolls become too worn, they are buried in Geniza, storehouses for sacred writing. The Cairo Geniza, discovered much later, contains fragments of contracts, poems, and letters, offering a time capsule of daily life. These fragments reveal jokes, prices, loves, and losses. They show that the weight of tradition coexists with the lightness, of ordinary human emotion. In all these ways, the ancient Hebrews and their descendants demonstrate that identity can be both anchored and mobile. Home is not always where one lives, but also what one remembers and practices. Law is not just a set of rules, but a conversation across generations. Faith is not static, but responsive, adapting to new circumstances while looking back to foundational stories. The diaspora is not a single event, but an ongoing condition, a series of movements and settlements, of losses and renewals. Recognizing this complexity enriches our understanding of history and of ourselves. It allows us to see that continuity does not require uniformity, and that diversity does not erase connection. Within homes across the diaspora, it is often women who anchor tradition with their hands and voices. In Babylon, in Alexandria, in Seville, they sweep dirt floors at dawn, grind grain in stone mills, and knead dough with salt and oil. They plait challah for the Sabbath and shape unleavened bread for Passover. They tend herbs on windowsills, basil and mint for stews, hyssop and thyme for roasting. They weave cloth on looms, their feet pressing petals, their fingers guiding threads. As they work, they hum melodies inherited from grandmothers. These songs recall psalms and proverbs, but they also include lullabies about birds nesting in fig trees and rivers flowing near distant cities. Voices low and steady fill courtyards, mingling with the cooing of doves and the chatter of children. In evenings, before sunset on Fridays, women light candles. They say blessings that sanctify the act of creating light. In a courtyard in Cordoba, an elder hands a candle to her granddaughter. The child repeats the words haltingly, her accent tinged with Arabic. In Baghdad, the wicks are made from twisted flax. In Rome, from cotton dipped in olive oil. The prayer is the same, though languages differ. After the candles are lit, families gather for a meal. The table is set with dishes reserved for the Sabbath, ceramic plates painted with blue vines, cups carved from coconut shells brought by merchants. A braided loaf of bread is covered with an embroidered cloth. A cup of wine or juice is lifted, and blessings are recited. There is a sense of peace, of separation from the workday world. Stories are told after the meal. Some are biblical, about Joseph's coat and the dreams of Pharaoh. Others are folk tales about wise fools who teach lessons through humor. Laughter comes easily in these stories, softening the week's worries. Women play important roles in education as well. Before boys are sent to study with rabbis, mothers teach them the alphabet by drawing letters in sand or on chalkboards. They trace each character with a finger and encourage the child to repeat its sound. When the child can say all the letters, a drop of honey is placed on a slate, and the child is allowed to lick it, associating learning with sweetness. Daughters, too, learn songs and sayings. They memorize the prayers for lighting candles and for separating challah. They learn how to maintain the purity of vessels, how to keep dietary laws, and how to show hospitality to guests. In some communities, women gather in the synagogue's women's section and follow the reading of the Torah with Yiddish or Ladino translations whispered among themselves. They ask questions and share interpretations. This engagement ensures that knowledge is not confined to formal study halls. It flows through kitchens and courtyards in the cadence of lullabies and proverbs. Family rituals mark life's transitions. When a child is born, elders come to hold the baby and whisper blessings. Boys are brought to circumcision ceremonies on the 8th day. Girls are celebrated with naming ceremonies where parents and grandparents choose names that recall ancestors. The names carry memories. A girl in Alexandria might be named Sarah, after a great-grandmother who crossed the desert. A boy in Narbonne might be named Moshe, for an ancestor who escaped a siege. Weddings involve a canopy held by friends. The bride circles the groom, binding her life to his in 7 loops. Wine is sipped, rings exchanged, and a glass is broken underfoot to remember the destruction of the temple, even in the midst of joy. Funerals are simple. Bodies are washed and wrapped in plain shrouds. Friends and family shovel earth onto the grave, the sound of soil on wood a reminder of mortality. Afterward, visitors come to offer comfort, bringing food and sitting in silence or sharing memories. During the week of mourning, mirrors are covered and chairs are low. The rituals are designed to channel grief into community support. Food itself tells stories of movement and adaptation. In Yemen, flatbreads are baked on convex metal plates over open fires. In Persia, rice is steamed with saffron and barberries. In Germany, noodles called Lokshen are served with chicken soup. Each dish has a lineage. Some incorporate local ingredients, dates in Iraq, olives in Greece, cassia in India. Others preserve flavors from long ago, haricot made of figs and nuts, recalling the mortar used by ancestors in Egypt. Holidays bring special dishes. On Purim, pastries shaped like triangles are filled with poppy seed or apricot jam, symbolizing the hat of Haman in the story of Esther. On Shabbat, cheesecake and blintzes celebrate the land of milk and honey. At Sukkot, meals are eaten outside under a roof of branches. The rustle of palm fronds overhead and the sight of stars through the gaps remind diners of wandering ancestors who lived in booths. Proverbs circulate alongside recipes. Better a neighbor nearby than a brother far away. A kind word is sweeter than honey. Even a king cannot make wheat ripen before its time. These sayings reflect values, patience, kindness, the acceptance of seasons. They are repeated often. Children internalize them without realizing. Years later, when faced with a difficult decision, a proverb rises to mind like an old friend. Lullabies also carry wisdom. A mother in Fez sings to her son about a dove flying over mountains, telling him that though he will travel far, he will always carry home in his heart. A grandmother in Baghdad hums a tune about a palm tree's resilience, bending in storms without breaking. These songs are practical and poetic at once. They soothe restless infants and instill resilience. Across different lands, languages shift. Hebrew remains the language of prayer. Aramaic is used in Talmudic discussion. In Spain, Ladino emerges, a blend of Hebrew and Old Castilian. In Germany, Yiddish develops, a fusion of Hebrew, German, and Slavic elements. Each language carries layers of history. Words from one language slip into another. A conversation in a market might include Hebrew blessings, Arabic greetings, and Greek measurements. This linguistic richness reflects the interwoven lives of diaspora communities. It also influences liturgy. Piyutim liturgical poems are composed in Hebrew but draw on Arabic meters. Kabbalistic texts are written in Aramaic but draw on imagery from Persian mysticism. Through language, people express their environment and their heritage. These domestic practices, cooking, teaching, singing, may seem small compared to wars and migrations, but they are the threads that hold the fabric together. When external circumstances change, when rulers demand new taxes or prohibit certain rituals, families adapt. They hide candles behind shutters. They recite prayers in whispers. They encode messages in songs. They teach in secret. These acts of preservation are quiet and steadfast. They do not seek recognition. They are done out of love and duty. They sustain a sense of self that is both individual and collective. In these quiet hours, as you let this long narrative settle, there is value in reflecting on the perseverance of a people whose story begins in movement and whose identity never fully settles. Their rituals and texts become portable, their prayers and memories carried across deserts and seas. They teach that home can be both a place and an idea, rooted in land but also in covenant and community. They show that laws can be a path to communal harmony and that ethical conduct matters more than power. They reveal that suffering does not end a story, but can be a point of transformation. Through slow centuries of wandering, building, exile, and return, the ancient Hebrews maintain a thread of continuity that binds them across time and space. Their journey invites us to consider our own, to notice how our lives are shaped by the landscapes we inhabit, the agreements we make, and the traditions we carry forward. This entire story, told gently, is an invitation to rest and to connect with the deep currents of human memory. As the narrative winds down, the pace softens even further. The images of ancient hills, of torchlight reflecting on stone, of wind moving through pillars, and of quiet steps in courtyards remain in your mind. The story circles back to its beginnings, to wanderers moving under stars, to promises made and retold. There is no rush to conclude, because history itself does not end. It flows into the present in subtle ways. Our telling stops here, leaving the Hebrews in the diaspora, their memory preserved in texts, in rituals, and in the very act of telling stories like this one. You may feel the weight of old spaces, the coolness of carved stone, and the dust of ancient roads. You may hear in the distance the whisper of prayers spoken in languages that have traveled through time. Let these impressions linger as you settle into rest, knowing that within each calm breath there is a connection to countless lives lived before you. Good night.